Okay. All right. So again, welcome everyone. Glad you've taken the time to attend this session. Kelly and I have done this now for, I think, 3 years in a row. One thing that we typically do is part of this session was also to have a student perspective. Given the late start this year and the short prep time that we had and not being able to be face to face, unfortunately, that part of it we weren't able to integrate into this presentation, but hopefully you still get a lot of good takeaways from the sections that Kelly and I will be presenting today. So as you can see, we have a few goals that we hope to achieve in our section today, and that is to explore the topic of student financial responsibility. Again, not implying that anyone is irresponsible. We're just trying to relay some lessons learned, some experiences that people commonly have when they're especially first-year student. Um, Highlight the importance of having a budget and establishing credit. Kelly and I will actually probably be focusing most on those two topics, and then identifying challenges facing students and highlighting the role of parents. So we're not going to, we're not going to be heavy-handed in that. We're just trying to give you some suggestions and provide some practical advice for avoiding problems and achieving success. So hopefully we achieve those objectives. And like I said, we will hang around till after the end of the presentation if you happen to have any questions. So the whole concept that started kind of this presentation was this slide, where your student, especially if they're a first-year student, might be their first time being away from home. They're living in a dorm. They're 100% on their own, but there's still this thought that if I get into some kind of financial trouble or just any kind of trouble, I'm always going to have my parents there to count on. And so what we want to do is stress that this is kind of the beginning of a transition in your student's life. And we want to start to instill the thought or the process that this is when they need to start building good habits, good financial habits. And hopefully we can make that point and have some good takeaways from that. So in order to get those points across, our kind of what the topics that we're going to discuss, as I mentioned before, we're going to focus on budget, we're going to focus on credit, primarily credit cards, and then living responsibly. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kelly, and she's going to focus on budgets.
Yes, so establishing a budget or creating a spending plan. I think that whenever you bring this topic up to a student, they don't know all the details necessarily, but they know that they don't want to have to spend time doing that because it just doesn't sound like fun. But if you kind of break it down into smaller pieces for them to think about, these are the pieces that you could have those conversations about. So the pieces of a budget, we all kind of know, but to focus on individual areas, the first one would be income. So as parents, sometimes we're giving our students a certain allowance, whatever you want to call it, a certain amount of money that they're able to spend each month. And you can think about this in terms of a month or a week, whichever you're most comfortable with. But you really want to ask the student if they have an established job or if they're doing a part-time job, or even if they're doing something like babysitting that's just occasionally. You want to think about where are they going to work or be employed? What kind of savings have they brought, and how do they want to break that down over time? So if their savings is for college, are we breaking that down into 4 years of undergraduate, or is there only a portion that you want to use for undergraduate? So thinking about that. Borrowed funds, if they're using student loans or loans from parents or any other source, you want to think about how do we budget so that we have to borrow as little as possible, but be sure to include that in what they're kind of using as their income for the semester or for the month. And then also the amount that your parents are providing. One of the things that I think is one of the most kind of important conversations to have when your student is at college and you're at home is who pays for what. So, you know, there are certain things that maybe the student assumes that parents are going to pay for, and the student thinks those are necessities that the parent's going to pay for, but maybe the parents have a different idea of what constitutes a necessity versus a luxury. So just having that conversation before it comes up naturally, which it will, I think that's a really good idea to do, just to kind of establish those boundaries. And I'm sure you'll have things that happen that don't, that are kind of still in that area of confusion. But I think even just having the conversation with them about the fact that there are two different types of expenses, a necessity and a luxury, and what as parents you're willing to support while they're away at college. Mark mentioned this in the previous slide about students feeling like I can budget all of my income because I know that my parents will help me if something happens that's an emergency or something I didn't plan for. So that's a good conversation to have up front too, is do you want for your student to have savings to fall back on for something that comes up in the future? A good example is if they want to take a spring break trip, or if they want to travel at some point, one of the summers or something like that. Is that something that they need to be saving towards now? Or is that something that you as parents will fund if it comes up, if that opportunity comes up out of nowhere? How, you know, that's a good example of something that it would be good to talk about. And then also, what will happen if they accidentally don't plan for something? So they intended to plan, but then it didn't work out that way. Is that something that you're willing to give them a short-term loan because it's a luxury and you told them you weren't willing to support that, but is it something that you would spot them for and have them pay you back? Or is it something that they just wouldn't be able to do? So establishing what will happen, who will be held accountable if they don't plan in advance. I think that actually is one of the hardest things to enforce or kind of establish with students, is that setting a budget does require that you allocate some time towards it. It's going to be something that every month or week, depending on kind of how they feel about doing it, you will have to sit down and focus on reviewing your expenses and making adjustments to what you're spending. One of the tools that is kind of commonly known in the budgeting world is the 50-20-30 rule. And I think that this is a good one to kind of let them be exposed to and think about as they're trying to make a plan for themselves. Their percentages may be different over time, but this is kind of where everybody kind of starts. So 50% of whatever income, and we talked about establishing how much income do you have coming in, 50% should be going towards essentials. So housing, transportation, groceries, and utilities. So things that are not ever not going to be an expense. Those are the things that you know for sure have to be covered in order to have the lifestyle. 20% towards financial priorities. So this is where the savings comes in for future things. So if a student's out of school and they're paying on their loans, they would want to put 20%, that would come from that 20%. Saving for an emergency, and we talked about letting students know that emergencies happen. So you do have to plan for that. That would be in that 20%. So it's not, 20% doesn't seem like a lot, but it's commonly overlooked, this 20%. And you want to make sure that they kind of know that does need to be reserved off to the side. And then the remaining amount is lifestyle. So that's where you can buy concert tickets. That's the spring break trip. That's, another one we have on here is pets. Pets can be very expensive and we don't think about that sometimes. And that's something that does fall into that, non-essential, but nice to have category. So those types of things should be about 30% of the budget. So this is really, I talked about how it does require some time to do this each month, but I think this is a really good exercise if at the end of the month they download their transactions and try to sort them into these categories. I think it can be really telling and interesting, and it can be the basis for a conversation about how to make small adjustments that make a big difference going down the road. There are lots and lots of tools online. Just about every bank has an app that they can download or sort. Some of the banking apps do this for you, where they can divide into different groups. So whatever, I would first look at what your bank offers, because what you're spending is being, those transaction details are held by the bank. So find out what your bank offers. But if it doesn't offer, there are lots of different apps that you can load your transactions into and use if they're more comfortable doing that than putting things on paper, like maybe we would have done whenever we were younger. So there's also just a very simple budget worksheet. And I'm thinking sometimes whenever you're having a conversation between parent and student, sometimes it is helpful just to have one single piece of paper to sit down and have that conversation with. So you can print off online some very simple budget worksheets that are helpful as well. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and he's going to talk about credit cards, credit monitoring, credit score, all things credit.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. This tends to be a hot topic because this is as your student is kind of transitioning. One of the questions that seems to always come to mind, I know it was when my sons were in college, it was, do we arrange for a credit card? How do we make sure they use it correctly? So on and so forth. So hopefully we'll explain some of the pros and cons and things that you should be aware of in this area, because it tends to be a pretty hot topic. First of all, I think hopefully most of us understand the difference between credit and debit cards. With the debit card, obviously that's a transaction. It appears as though, if you're using a terminal or something like that, where you're paying for some kind of good or service, the transaction looks very similar because you're inserting a card. The problem is with a debit card, obviously that's tied to, usually a checking account that you have, and that's automatically charging that account or debiting that account. So if you had a balance of 1,000 and all of a sudden you've are paying for something for 500, it's going to be a $500 charge against that account right away to bring your balance down to 500. So most people are aware, but we just want to make sure that people understand the difference between those two. We feel like the one thing that we can't stress enough is that if you're going to get a credit card, the main thing is to use it responsibly. And I hate to say that we go as far as say that we are encouraging people to get a credit card. So I'm going to stop just short of saying that. But if you feel that your student is responsible with a credit card, can make the payments on time, pay off that balance at the end of each month, they will be doing themselves a great favor in getting into good habits early and establishing a good credit score. And we'll get into this a little bit more later, but the main point is you want to somewhere early, and now's as good a time as any, to start establishing credit and maintain a good credit score. The next point is probably, kind of lesser importance, probably more for parents than students, quite frankly. But instead of just having lots of credit cards around and, haphazardly using one and then another, maybe getting to the habit of using that one credit card for most of your purchases, getting into the habit of paying that down as much as you can each month. And then, maybe having that other one that's used for emergencies only. So anyway, it's not all that important of a point, but the fact of the matter is, what we're trying to stress is just not having, lots of credit cards outstanding, each of them with large balances, so on and so forth. So the next slide is really where we get a lot of questions. A lot of questions come up with, can my student go and get a credit card on their own? Should I be a co-signer? Should I not be a co-signer? A lot of these are based upon state laws, state by state. In general, if your student can actually get a credit card on their own, that's probably not a bad idea. It's not always that easy, especially if they've never worked or don't have any kind of established work history or income history. But if they can get a credit card on their own, that's not a bad option. Again, but we'll keep stressing the fact of making sure it's used wisely, because that's going to affect their credit. Now, here's where it really becomes difficult. If they can't get a credit card on their own and they have to have the parent as a co-signer, parents, hopefully you're aware that if that card is not used responsibly, that will be reflected on your credit score. So if the student, racks up a balance, now the good part is when a student is assigned or gets a card with a parent as a co-signer, a lot of times they can establish their own credit limit. So it wouldn't be necessarily the same credit limit as you. So if you can get a card that they're co-signing on and the balance is low, that's kind of your safety net. But just realize that because you are a co-signer, if that card is used irresponsibly and, maintains its maximum balance, never gets paid, not even the minimum gets paid each month, then that will wind up, reflecting on you. The other thing that we try to stress in having a credit card and using it responsibly, we are really strongly advocating that whatever gets put or charged on that card, try to get paid off the next month. We used to have a comment on here that this was the credit card scam, which was stating a minimum balance. We got a little bit of criticism for calling it the bank scam, so we stopped calling that. Okay, so and I actually noticed that one of the participants is from a bank right now, so we don't want to knock any banks. We love banks. We work with banks all the time in Treasury. But the thing that we want to stress is if you get into the habit of just making the minimum payment, behind the scenes, you are racking up significant amount of interest charges. And we would strongly discourage that. That's the first experience that your student has with a credit card, is saying, okay, well, all I have to do is make that minimum payment. Actually, the mentality that we would really like to stress is that your student get into the habit of whatever they're going to put on that credit card, they manage and have a mindset that they're going to pay off as much as, if not all of that got charged in the prior month. So that's the main takeaway there. The next section gets into credit monitoring. And I would say, that this is one area especially since the financial crisis of 2008, where there's been a lot of a lot of changes in the consumer credit area, and I would say for the better. So what happens is that you can see in this second bullet point, the Fair Credit Reporting Act actually gave people the ability to access their credit score free on at least an annual basis. So we really stress that it's very important for you as a parent, for your student, if they get, again, if they've got a credit card, that they should go in and periodically look at their credit score and look at their credit report to make sure that there isn't or that there aren't things showing up on that that look strange. Um, I'll tell you, I mean, from personal experience, probably a year doesn't go by where we get a call from our particular credit card issuer that says, did you charge $2.35 to a quick trip in Birmingham, Alabama? And, you know, and it was like, no, never been in Birmingham. So the one thing good is the credit card companies are getting much, much better at identifying fraudulent charges. But don't rely on the credit cards and all their algorithms in catching these charges. You know, a lot of the onus is on you too, especially if you know for sure that, oh, I was in a restaurant. Well, yeah, who's been in a restaurant lately? But still, you know, when have I potentially used my credit card and I inadvertently left it in the machine, I left it on the counter, whatever it is. You know, if that kind of situation were to happen, you know, immediately notify the credit card issuer or go online, you know, stop or freeze that credit card until you can locate it, make sure, you know, that it hasn't been compromised. So, but the main takeaway, it's really important to monitor your credit card, especially your credit score, which leads us into the next slide, which is the one reason we're stressing that it is important to go ahead and you know, use a credit card responsibly, is that the thing that really needs to be stressed with your student is that what they're trying to do is establish credit. And you establish credit by using that card responsibly and building up a score. And so based upon how you use your card, you know, whether or not you maintain balances, whether or not you've got a lot of cards outstanding based upon other debt that you've got outstanding. So I guess I should point out the credit score isn't solely based on just your credit card use. It just tends to dominate it more. But if you've got other things outstanding, you know, most people have a mortgage, a lot of people have car loans, you know, signature loans, whatever it might be, it's important to manage all of those outstanding debts responsibly, and that goes into determining your credit score. And as you can see from this chart on the bottom, you know, what goes into that credit score. So again, you can see it right there, but these are the most recent that we were able to pull, is that your payment track record dominates your credit score. In other words, making payments on time, not being behind, not incurring late charges, the overall amount of debt you owe. So, you know, keeping balances low is a help. It shows that based upon your income, you know, how much are you able to actually afford in debt. You know, if you start getting over levered, or, you know, more debt that you can than you can afford on a monthly basis, this is eventually going to affect your credit score. How long you've used your credit. So again, back to your student, they're just starting. So if they've got a 4-year track record by the time they finish college, and they've got a good history on just a credit card alone, that's going to help significantly with their credit card or their credit score. How often you've applied for a credit card. You know, in other words, if you're applying for a new card every single month, then that's kind of a red flag, you know, to the industry that, you know, you have the potential to be running up a lot of debt quickly. And again, the kind of then to the last point, the types of credit you currently have. So, again, the more typical are house loan, car loan, credit card debt, student loan debt, obviously, to the extent that you have still student loans outstanding. But in other words, if you're racking up a lot of different types of debt, then that raises a red flag as well. So anyway, that ends my section on credit cards. Hopefully you've seen the takeaway is we really want to, this is the beginning that your student is going to have experiencing managing debt, and we want them to get off on the right foot by making regular payments and developing a good credit score. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kelli for the section that we call Living Responsibly.
Thank you, Mark. So a lot of these conversations, your opportunity to have them is going to be while the student is in school. So hopefully while they're in school, they're developing these good habits that whenever they get out of school, they'll be able to kind of manage these topics on their own. While they're in school, of course, you as parents are working with them, but also you might encourage them to take a personal finance course. So a lot of students in their senior year or even their junior year will take a class in the business school that is a personal finance course and talks to them about things like retirement plans, so that when they start to get job offers, they understand the concept of a 401k and an employer match. They also talk about mortgages and the fact that, this was on the previous slide, the fact that whenever you are applying for an apartment, they do check your credit score, or when you're applying for a job, they check your credit score. So you do want to encourage them to either take a course, or there's a lot of good online content too, where they can kind of go through a webinar or something like this and just listen to how to think about those things that they're going to have coming to them in the future. Mind your spending and resisting impulse purchases. I think we've all heard over this pandemic this year, I know I have had friends that say, I have got to stop online shopping, because sometimes whenever people are under stress or bored or, just having downtime, I guess, and need something to do, online shopping is something that we do. Going out and doing expensive hobbies is another thing that we do. So I think even just talking with your student about recognizing when they're feeling stress and how they deal with it, and that if their impulses are to spend money that's not within that 30% that they've budgeted, what are some alternatives? What are some things that we can do to resist those kind of impulse buying that later on you regret because you haven't balanced your budget? The other thing is not to miss payments. And this one you really want to stress because of the percents that Mark showed you about what is taken into consideration whenever your credit score is being billed. So a lot of credit cards, if you have a monthly payment, they do allow you to set up an automatic debit of the minimum payment. And then if you do make it, because your goal is always to pay that off, not just to make the minimum payment, if you make your payment before the due date, then they don't take the minimum payment. But the benefit to setting that up is that you don't miss the due date, because missing due dates, especially early in establishing your credit, is a big factor in what the credit score ends up being. So you want to help them safe-proof themselves against ever missing a payment. So for some, they can put it on the calendar and they follow a calendar on their phone or written, that they will be sure not to miss those payments. But for most people, their online tools, I think, because life gets busy, and sometimes, usually for me, it's always during the summer when we take a vacation, I really try to get off of all of the technology and really shut down being on my phone. And during those times are whenever you just happen to miss one of the things that you know you have to pay that month. So setting up those online tools and using those is always a good idea. I do want to say a bit about student loans, just because that's the area where my expertise lies. And this chart is for the federal direct loan program. So every student is eligible for the federal student loans. And there are two different types. One is subsidized, which is need-based, and then there's unsubsidized, which any student can qualify for. The unsubsidized does accrue interest while you're in school. Sometimes if students want to do things that you as parents don't want to fund, or that you think is a luxury, but they feel like they really are wanting to do it, sometimes student or parents will allow their students to take a small student loan that they haven't had them take in the past. I just want to let you know that the unsubsidized does accrue interest while you're in school. I always tell parents, if their student has to take the unsubsidized, one thing that it would be generous to do is to pay the interest for them while they're in school, especially if they plan to go on to graduate school. That way, if they borrow $2,000, it'll be $2,000 when they're out of school and start paying that back. But just remember that this is a resource for you. The stories that you hear about students getting into debt trouble for undergraduate are not usually because they've taken advantage of the federal student loan products. Because you can see that there are maximums to those. If a student took the maximum federal student loans, they would have just the 55, 65, 75, 75, about $25,000 in student loans, which is about a car payment when they get out of school. So that's not bad at all. Where you hear students have kind of nightmare stories is this bottom bullet, which is other sources, including university loan programs or private student loans. Students can go to a bank and get a loan from a bank for education or for educational purposes, and take that in their name. And sometimes when parents and students disagree about what a student should be spending money on, students will do this. And this is where you hear the nightmare stories. So I think private loans sometimes can have very high interest rates, and it's almost like putting things on a credit card. So I would have that conversation just to let your students know you will be solicited by banks for student loans that are available to you. So at what level is it troublesome? Right? So what types of loans are the best if you have to take them? And what loans should you really avoid now and in the future? What types of loans would have the best interest rates and are for things that are necessities? And what types of loans are really like charging whatever it is on a credit card? And then also, one of the things, and this goes back to what I was saying about the 50-30-20 rule and just establishing with your student that it does take a certain amount of focus and time that you have to dedicate to managing your budget. The same goes for your debt. For students who are taking out a student loan, and I have them in my office, I will always say, I know students store everything electronically now. We e-sign a lot of our loan notes. It is wonderful to keep those on your computer, but I always say, please make a folder that's all caps, important documents, and put those things there. They really should not be your legal documents, your loan documents, your budgeting documents should not be mixed in with your assignments and all of the other kind of games you have on your computer. They really need to have a special place for keeping good records, whether that's electronically or paper. I'm old school. I always tell students, wonderful if you're saving it electronically, but if I were you, I would print one copy, put it in a folder called important records, just so whenever you're getting close to graduation, you know where to start and what you kind of have in your portfolio of important obligations that you've made, important decisions. If you've made some investments, put those in the important documents. It's just a good habit and kind of gets them started with a filing system, which they'll need whenever they start having a mortgage and a car payment and insurance and all of those things. So just getting that started is a good thing to encourage. I mentioned this before, only borrow what you need for college. If at all possible, it would be great to avoid loans. If you need to take loans, there are loans you can take that will not be, have negative consequences for you in the future. So, but either way, set your budget and don't borrow extra just to have that savings or safeguard. Save the extra over time. Don't take a loan for that. So the other thing is, I mentioned this with the unsubsidized loans. If you ever have to take a loan that does accrue interest while you're in school, it is possible. A lot of people don't realize that you can set it up to be billed for interest only. And to me, like I said, a lot of our students are undergraduate for 4 years, and then they're going on to graduate school or med school or whatever the case may be. And that means that the loan is accruing interest for several years. So it may not seem like much if you pay it as you go. It's best to do that so that whenever you get to paying it off, your cumulative balance is what you borrowed and not with all of that interest. I just want to mention 2 offices on campus while a student's in school. If the family situation changes, if the student has any financial concerns at all, Student Financial Services is always available. They can have this type of conversation with your student. They can have this type of conversation with you if something happens and there's a job loss, or, this year, everyone's situation has changed to some extent, it seems like. So just remember that they are there, even if you haven't spoken to their office before and you're a junior, they are still at your service to help you if your family is struggling in any way financially. Also, when you start talking to your student about budget, like I said, it is no one's favorite topic, right? So if your student sets a budget and then gets into trouble of some sort, it can be really stressful. So just let them know that if it's something, let's say that impulse buying has gotten out of control and they don't know why they're doing that, that might be a good time to use the resources at Student Health Services to kind of help themselves. Sometimes it's good for them to hear from someone other than their parents about how to manage that stress, and remember that those resources are there. So Mark's going to talk to you about saving a little bit before we end. We're getting close to the end.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Kelly. First, I wanted to make sure I mentioned this. So that you don't think that WashU spends extravagant amounts of money on office space, my background is fake. That is not my office. And if you saw my office, then you'd really appreciate that WashU does not pay extravagantly for office space. So anyway, I just want to make that clear. So the next session, and getting right down towards the very end, may seem a little bit out of place because this is really more planning the thought for when your student starts working. And yes, that day will come. Believe it or not, there will come when they graduate and start working. So when that day comes, one of the things that they will be asked when they first start working is that, do you want to participate in the company 401k or 403b program? And just so that you know the difference, In general, I mean, there are exceptions, but in general, if it's a 401k, it means they're working for a for-profit company. If they're working for a 403b, like Washington University, then it's a 403b. For the most part, they work very, very much the same. Um, a common feature of both a 401k and 403b program is that the employer usually matches up to some percentage the contribution that the employee has elected to make. So, you know, one thing that I cannot stress enough is that if if the employer says that we will match the first 5% of money that you set aside, then, I mean, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it. It is an absolute no-brainer to put in at least 5% because you are getting an automatic 5% return because it's free money. I mean, they're putting it in. If you put it in, they'll put it in. The only thing is sometimes some employers will not do the match right away. They may have a cliff period or a period where that you have to be employed for a year or two. And so, but still, I would strongly encourage that people right away start setting that money aside. And to stress that point, we've put together a little example. Now, it might be a little bit exaggerated because, you know, this is assuming that the investment return that you can get is 10%. You know, those days have kind of come and gone. It's hard to get a 10% return anymore, except for, I will put in a plug for our endowment folks. They did earn a return of 9.8% for the year ended 6/30/20. So we give them a little kudo for, I think they're going to be maybe number 2 ranked in the country for large endowments in the country. So, but getting back to the script here, the point we're trying to make is saving, starting early is extremely important. So the example that we've given here is Joe right away, right as soon as he gets his job, says, yep, sign me up for that 401k program. And so at age 25, he starts putting in $2,000 a year. And he does that, and we've just, for illustration purposes, we're saying he does that for 7 years and then stops. Not that we're encouraging you to stop, but we're just trying to make a point. And then by the time he's ready to retire at 65, although by that time he'll probably not be able to retire till 70. But the point is, at a 10% return, his balance would have grown to over $500,000. And now remember, that's him only investing in the first 7 years at $2,000 a year, and then he stops. Then you've got poor Harry. Harry says, nah, I can't really afford it right now. I've got too many bills. I'm just going to wait. And so he waits for 7 years. And then he finally sees the light and says, okay, I'm going to start at 32. And for every year until he turns 65, he puts in 2,000 a year. And we've just purposely picked these dates to drive the point home. They end up at the same point. So what this is trying to drive home is start as early as you can, no matter how small it is. Hopefully we all realize the magic of compounding is significant, especially when you're saving on kind of a tax deferred way, and those earnings can grow without taxes. So, never too early to have that conversation with your student about working. And, first thing to plant into their mind is already start planning for retirement and participate in the employer's program of a 401k or 403b. All right, so we're going to wrap up here. This page is, there's a lot of good websites out there that touch on anything from, renting an apartment, buying a car, going to college. They just so many good resources out there right now. And, can't stress enough that, we are at WashU actually starting a financial literacy program. There's actually access to a website that we would strongly recommend. I always make,
Yeah.
I'll just say I always would make myself available in case that were, if somebody wants to ask me a question personally, that's fine with me. So the one thing that we want to, hopefully we've achieved our objectives for the session, which, it's good to have those conversations right now between you and your student. We want to make sure that there's, that you address this fact that affects almost all students, is that now that they're away from their parents, there's this false sense of independence. We want to, instill this and encourage this responsible financial behavior and set expectations and limits. We feel that's really important. And then we'll end with a list of resources that you can access. We've checked these out. They all seem to be pretty good resources. There's a lot out there, but these are just a few that we would recommend. So with that, I think we're going to open up for questions. Like I said, we are about 5 minutes early. We'll hang around for as long as it takes. If there's any questions, we'll stick around and be happy to answer them. Whether you want to ask them by raising your hand, or it looks like there's a few things in chat here. Let's see, let's take a look at that. But if you want to raise your hand and ask the question, remember, just use that participant tab and just click on raise your hand. Let's see. Okay. Looks like we had a question and you've already answered that one, Kelly, it looks like, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
We do. Oh, no. No questions.
Okay.
All right.
Well, we'll hang around a little bit in case somebody wants to wait till the group size gets down a little bit smaller. But we really thank you guys for participating today. If you have any follow-up questions at all, please feel free to reach out to Kelly or myself. We'll be more than happy to answer them through email.
Okay, we do have one here. How do students access the new WashU Student Literacy Program? That program is called Cash Course, and it's on the financialaid.worcester.edu website. I have not verified that it's out there right now, but it is going to be. So if you go there and you look under financial resources or financial literacy, there's a tab at the top of the screen and it's not there, stay tuned because it will be very soon. And it's called Cash Course. And every WashU student will have access to use all of those resources. And
I think part of that too was there's a good budgeting tool built into Cash Course that's kept private, but it's very we have vetted it. We looked at a lot of different resources, and this one really kind of percolated to the top.
We had a question about, can you show the slide with the website?
There you go.
Option. So this is it. And then also we will have a copy of the slides, I believe, with the recorded session as well.
In that section that'll be there, Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
If not, you can reach out to Kelly or myself too, and we can make sure we get it to you through email.
One comment that I think is helpful is one of our participants said that one thing you want to mention to your student is that single tax filers who make under $124,000 a year are able to contribute $6,000 a year to a Roth IRA. These contributions, unlike regular IRAs, will not be taxed in the future. So that's a good point, that's something that they probably want to take advantage of early in their career while they can. And then later down the road, they'll appreciate that, being able to pull out those earnings tax-free.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, and that's a lot of time that's embedded within the 403B or 401k option. There's an option to do it as a Roth rather than as a tax exempt. So yes, that's true.
Any other comments or questions? I hope you guys enjoy your parents' weekend. This is one unlike any other.
Yeah, right.
The least we can say that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're in a kind of a classroom setting, and we get to see everybody's face, and you know, it's always nice to see the students and parents together. And but you know, obviously, we missed that this time, so that was definitely missed. But hopefully
Fingers
next year
crossed
we'll
for
get to see
next
you,
year.
because we do this every year. So
Right. Well, thank you all for attending and have a good weekend.
yeah, thank you all very much.